Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our POOIA Professional Organization of Iranian Americans, a monthly lecture series. I would like to extend my profound appreciation and gratitude to our learned scholar and distinguished speaker, Dr. Christian James, or Christine James, for whose presence I am indebted to Dr. Bahram Hojjati, professor of Valdesta University and a member of Kanoon. Ladies and gentlemen, our POOIA supporters and donors and the members of the board of POOIA. For those of you who do not know what POOIA is an affiliate of Kanoon and is a non-religious, non-political, and purely an independent organization which holds monthly lectures by scholars in different sciences to give us a wide spectrum of different sciences in addition to humanities and cultural topics, glorifying our country, Iran. All the POOIA lectures are in English so that the American and international professionals and young Iranian Americans who unfortunately do not know Farsi be able to participate. In addition to this, every year, POOIA has an annual gala giving awards to some brilliant Iranian students from different fields from different universities. Our gala this year is on January 25, 2025, and pretty soon, the announcement will be on, and there's a link there, and you can actually buy your tickets. We are proud to announce that our keynote speaker this year is Dr. Farrokh Ayazi, Professor, Director of the Georgia Tech Analog Consortium, and the Key Buyers Professor at Georgia Institute of Technology in Atlanta. POOIA works tirelessly to uphold the pillars of its mission. Number one, to create a sense of synergy within population of Iranian Americans. Number two, to provide an opportunity for Iranian American professionals to network and support each other. Number three, to provide other forms of advice such as internship, career, counseling, financial support in a few cases, etc., to support our young professionals. Number four, to become an anchor of support while creating a channel for Iranian American professionals to share their accomplishments, experiences, etc. Number five, to help the next generation of Iranian American professionals to succeed and prosper. And number six, and the last one, to promote a positive image and counter the negative media depiction of Iran and Iranian people. POOIA has a board of directors different from that of Kanoon. The board members are all professionals in different fields. Now I'm going to introduce Dr. Christine James very briefly. Dr. Christine James is the Fuller E. Callaway Chair and Professor of Philosophy and Religious Studies at Valdesta State University. Before joining the faculty at Valdesta State University, she was an assistant professor of philosophy at Kent State University and Allegheny College. Her specialization is philosophy of science. She has published a variety of articles and book chapters in scholarly journals, including the Journal of Philosophical Practice, the International Journal of Sociology and Social Policy, the Journal of Consciousness Studies and Biosemiotics, and the Journal of Human Rights. Her logic textbook, Principles of Logic and Reasoning, including LSAT, GRE, and Writing Skills, was published by Kendall Hunt in 2015. She also created a new logic book with expanded reading examples by invitation from Cognella in 2022, titled Principles of Logic and Argumentation, Selected Readings and Legal Examples. And she grew up in Chicago. Tonight, Dr. James is going to talk to us philosophy for every day and the art and skills of argumentation. Dr. James, on behalf of POOIA and Kanoon, I thank you very much, and we are all ears to hear what you're going to present tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the wonderful invitation. I really appreciate it. It's wonderful to be here with you, and I'm so excited to share all of the information that I can tonight with you. I hope that my PowerPoint is looking good for
Yes.
you. And it's one of those things where I really appreciate the invitation because usually we end up having a class in the history of philosophy where we talk about Locke, and usually we have a separate class where we do logic and argumentation. So this is a unique opportunity to bring together these different parts of philosophy and share them with you. For this talk, I was hoping that I could share with you the idea of Locke and the importance of experience in knowledge, the idea that we gain knowledge by experience over time and through the senses. And I was also going to talk a little bit about the idea of the association of ideas. When we think about Locke's theory of knowledge, we think about the idea that we have certain concepts or certain assumptions, and sometimes those associations of ideas need to be challenged by logic and reasoning. Now, we're also going to talk a little bit about some fallacies and potential examples of bad reasoning that we might see in everyday life. And we'll talk a little bit about the idea of how Locke also has a political philosophy involving a social contract, and that we have a social contract with each other and with our government. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about modern day issues like social media and artificial intelligence. And we're going to look at how critical thinking might be able to help us deal with some of those challenges in day-to-day life. So here's a little bit of background information about John Locke. He lived in England in the 1600s to 1704, and he was someone who was an empiricist materialist. I always think of empiricism and materialism as being philosophical points of view that answer a question. So if someone's asking, how do you gain knowledge? An empiricist thinks that you gain knowledge by using your senses, by having empirical experiences. And if you're not an empiricist, then you're probably a rationalist. Rationalist philosophers believe that knowledge comes from thinking and contemplation and just focusing on the concepts in our mind already. Now, there's another question that you could ask that is the materialist idea. What do we have actual knowledge of? Do we have knowledge of matter and physical things in the world around us? That would be a materialist point of view. If we only have knowledge of ideas that might be in our mind or in the mind of some kind of divine entity like a god, then that would be idealism. So Locke has a special place, especially for those of us who are invested in the sciences, because he does find that we use our senses to gain knowledge. The knowledge works, the knowledge is reliable, and the matter is what is most important. So let's think a little bit about what kinds of examples we might come up with out of this theory. Locke is saying that when you are born as a small child, as a baby, you are a tabula rasa. That's a Latin phrase that means blank slate. And over time, as we have experiences, we actually are writing on that blank slate. We are adding up knowledge and keeping it in us. So we have real knowledge of even ideas from some experience that we had in the first place. Now, when we think about the types of ideas and the types of matter that we could be having knowledge of, Locke also has a really interesting distinction between simple and complex ideas. For example, there could be a simple idea that is a characteristic of a thing. And the complex idea would be adding up all of those simple ideas and putting them together in the complex idea. So for example, here we're taking a look at a table and it's going to have a number of different simple ideas. We can think about it being flat. Flatness is a simple idea. Having four legs would be a simple idea. Having the color light brown would be another simple idea. And then if you all add those up together, then you get the complex idea of this table. It kind of might be related to the everyday topic of buying a car. When you buy a car, you're going to be choosing what kinds of add-ons, what kinds of options you might like to have in the car. Should it have a CD player? Should it have heated seats? Those would be kind of an interesting example of the simple ideas that could make up the complex idea of the car. Now, when it comes to these ideas that we are exposed to over time, Locke has a deep concern about education and whether or not someone might be given a mistaken or faulty belief by an incorrect association of ideas. See, sometimes we learn by custom, by chance, and we can end up having misled ideas that we are, perhaps misled by. And so it ends up being a process of education that Locke is recommending to try and stop us from having this kind of difficulty of having an incorrect set of ideas or an inappropriate kind of idea. One of the examples that he mentions that's kind of funny is the idea of a child who is being raised in a home and they have a governess who might be a little bit foolish, and the governess is always telling them that they should be afraid of the dark. That idea is kind of a repeated idea that is not really accurate, and it's not really based on good sensation information. It's not really based on the senses. So another distinction that Locke makes to help us understand the problem is that you can have ideas that come from sensation, using your senses, reliable knowledge like the kind that a scientist would use in an experiment, or you can end up having reflections. Usually reflections are remembered sensations, remembered prior experiences, but you can end up having someone try to manipulate you with bad reflections or with misled ideas. That's a concern that Locke has, that he wants to make sure that we are, using education to not leave us stuck with inappropriate reflections. Here's an example of the kind of mistaken association that Locke talks about. When he's writing his essay on human understanding, he is mentioning the idea that we have to prevent children from being given foolish ideas. In his time and place, there were foolish maids or foolish governesses. And so there's an element that we should acknowledge that this is a little bit sexist. It's a little bit old fashioned that he's saying this. But he's concerned that children might be left in the position of being afraid of the dark because of someone like a foolish maid telling them that the darkness has goblins and sprites and that they should be afraid of these goblins and sprites. Locke says that this is not something that we should be doing, that we should not be joining these ideas of darkness with other negative things in the darkness, because it would end up being misleading for the children and it leaves them in the position of being afraid and not being sure what to do about it. So you could imagine that Locke's theory of education is one to keep in mind when raising children. Now, the other thing that I think is so interesting about Locke's association of ideas is that you can end up thinking about it in terms of logic and reasoning. If someone has associations of ideas that are actually not very helpful or not very productive, you could say that they might be making a bad argument. They might actually be trying to spread bad misinformation, as we sometimes see people perhaps doing on social media. So if we look at this idea of logic and Locke's theory, the first thing to think about would be that there are different kinds of arguments that we discuss in logic. Two of the main types are deductive and inductive arguments. And we usually define a deductive argument as being the kind of argument where the premises will make the conclusion necessarily true. So you have a very strict relationship where the premises don't leave any doubt. They don't leave any chance of odds or probability. Inductive arguments are not necessarily true. Inductive arguments end up having premises that just make the conclusion likely or probable to some degree. So you can have inductive arguments that are strong and inductive arguments that are actually quite weak or quite problematic. So let me show you some examples of what this might be like. A deductive argument has, remember, the necessary relationship between premises and conclusions. So if we have an argument where we are saying, if it is winter in New York, then it is summer in Sydney, Australia, that premise could be said to be true once we understand that the seasons are the opposite in the northern and southern hemispheres. And then if we have for premise 2, it actually is winter in New York right now, for the sake of argument, we can say that it's wintertime in New York in December. Then the conclusion would be necessarily it must be summer then in Sydney. So if I were to call a friend in Sydney, Australia and say, how is the weather there? It would be summertime weather that we would be talking about. Now, The idea of an inductive argument doesn't have that same strict certainty. Another way to say it is sometimes I tell my students deductive arguments can actually sound a little bit boring or a little bit trivially true. If you understand what the words mean, that you can tell if a deductive argument works or is good or not. But with inductive arguments, there's going to be an element of odds or an elements of probability that's going on in this case. Here we see an inductive argument about graduating from Valdosta State University. Those of you who are professors might be familiar with some of these kinds of scenarios where students are trying to figure out how soon they can graduate, whether they're going to be ready to graduate, what classes do they need to graduate. Here at VSU, we will very often tell students you need 120 hours earned to graduate from Valdosta State University. And then if you have a student named Bob who says he has 120 earned hours, can we then assume, will we have a necessary conclusion that Bob is going to graduate? Well, actually, no. We have to ask questions like what classes did Bob take? And what were the different requirements that he actually fulfilled? Did he actually fill in the lines of a checklist for his whole major? Or did he decide to take different classes that he just found interesting in the moment? In that particular situation, we could say it's only likely or probable that Bob will actually graduate. We'll have to look at his checklist. We'll have to see if he has done his requirements properly. Now, when arguments go wrong, this argument about Bob graduating, if somebody really believed it and thought that it was a good, strong argument, we would have to say that this argument was making a fallacy. And that fallacy would be hasty generalization. It's easy to generalize and say students with 120 hours graduate, but actually there's a more subtle way of understanding the information. And so understanding when you've had a fallacy in an argument can be really helpful, especially with everyday examples of logic and reasoning and trying to understand what is actually going on in a particular example of critical thinking. So fallacies are very common and they're very difficult to recognize. When they happen within an argument, very often it's because somebody really wants to convince somebody else of something. You will see fallacies in advertising on a regular basis because people want to be convinced to, buy things. There's marketing executives who know that fallacies happen so much that it's because they work. It's because people are tricked by them psychologically, almost like the child described by Locke in his theory of education. So, when fallacies happen, we have to think about three major issues that might happen within an argument. You could have premises of the argument that are not relevant, and that would create a fallacy involving irrelevant reasons in the argument. Premises can be insufficient to actually prove a conclusion. For example, there could be not enough data. They might not have given us full information. In the social sciences, when someone is a psychologist and they're doing research involving surveys and samples of people's opinions about specific issues, very often what they have to think about is, okay, what's going to be the kind of thing that we need to do to have a representative sample, to have enough people in our survey where we can say that this is statistically significant. So the sufficiency problem relates directly to how much data has been collected and whether or not you have a representative sample of people doing your social science experiment. The third problem that fallacies can come from is when there are unacceptable premises in the argument. An unacceptable premise in an argument is when someone is using a word incorrectly, or they're not using the right definition of a word, or they're letting the meaning slip from one use of a word to another, or they have premises that are just sort of repeating a part of the premises in the conclusion. So let me take a look with you at this list of fallacies. I should say, first of all, that there are at least, 2,000 fallacies that have been cataloged and written about. But these are some of the main ones that I would say happen very often and especially happen in day-to-day life. When we look at the fallacies of relevance, that's the first column that you see over on the left side. An appeal to force, in Latin it's called the argumentum ad baculum. That's an argument where someone is trying to threaten the person with some kind of bad consequence or some kind of punishment. In logic classes, I like to joke around that sometimes parents will do the appeal to force. Like, if you don't do your homework, then I'm not going to give you an allowance this week. That's actually an appeal to force because the parent is saying, look, you're going to have a punishment. You're going to have something that goes wrong for you unless you do what I tell you. The appeal to pity, in Latin the argumentum ad misericordiam, is a fallacy where someone is trying to make another person feel pity for them. They want that person to feel sad for them. Like, please give me this job. Please hire me. I have a sick child at home. I really need the money. We say that that's a fallacy, even though it might, affect us emotionally. We might feel bad for the person. It's not really giving us the right kind of information to hire somebody. It's not explaining their qualifications. It's not explaining why they would be a good employee. Another fallacy that has to do with relevance of the premises to the conclusion is the appeal to popularity. Some people call this the bandwagon fallacy. It's the idea that because many, many people like something, like an idea, then everybody should like it and you should like it too. You see that in advertising quite often. Because something is popular, it's assumed to be the best, or it's assumed to be something that you should buy too. Now, next up is the ad hominem fallacy, and that's to the person in Latin. What it really means is that someone, instead of responding to another person's argument or the case that they've made for their position, they respond by making fun of them or mocking them or saying something negative about them as a person instead of replying to their actual argument. Another fallacy is straw man or straw person. This is the fallacy of reasoning where one doesn't respond to another person's argument in an accurate way. They misrepresent what the other person's point of view is. So they're trying to make the person look weak as if they're made out of straw by misrepresenting their argument, their position, as weaker than what it really is. Missing the point is an argument where you have a conclusion that goes far beyond what the end result of the argument should be. They've missed the point and gone overboard. They've gone over to a further point of view. For example, someone might make an argument that says that drunk driving is a very serious crime and it deserves a serious punishment. And then they might say, therefore, I conclude that the death penalty should be the punishment for drunk driving. We would say that that's a fallacy of missing the point because it's gone too far in the conclusion. They didn't really prove why the penalty should be that much. They've made a good case for increased prison time, perhaps, but not for the death penalty. And then we have red herring. Red herring is a fallacy where someone tries to distract people from the original point of view of the argument, from the original issue in the argument, just to see if they can kind of trick them, bringing up something that's totally irrelevant and trying to distract them. The name red herring comes from back in the day of British fox hunting, where there would be people trying to hunt foxes with groups of dogs, a pack of hounds, as it were, and to try and get the pack of hounds to get off the track of the fox that they were hunting at the end of the day when they all wanted to go home. They would take a red herring, a fish, and drag it in front of the fox, in front of the hound's path, and then that would make the hounds actually follow the fish home instead of following the fox. So it's distracting a bunch of people from what the real issue is. Now, under sufficiency, we've got another set of fallacies that we can talk about and how often they happen in day-to-day life. In an improper appeal to authority or unqualified authority, that's an argument in which a person, usually one famous person, is being cited as the person whose point of view we should follow along with, that we have to agree with this person. For example, if someone is raised Roman Catholic, they might believe that the Pope in Rome is infallible, and there would be certain religious ideas in which it would be a proper appeal to authority to ask what the Pope would say. But then if someone says, well, I agree with whatever the Pope says, and the Pope says vanilla is the best flavor of ice cream, then I must have vanilla ice cream because the Pope says so. That's going to be an inappropriate use of the authority concept. The Pope's not really an authority on ice cream. And we could joke around with ourselves about, maybe Ben and Jerry might be a better set of people who are authorities on ice cream. Now, next up, we have the appeal to ignorance. This is a really interesting kind of argument that people will use when it's a case of the information is not yet complete, the research is not done, but please believe me and what my point of view is. Sometimes you'll see people saying this about things like the potential for there to be alien life on other planets. If someone says, well, we haven't disproven that there's alien life on other planets, so you should agree with me that there is alien life on other planets, that's an appeal to ignorance. We're appealing to the idea that we are currently ignorant, that we haven't done the research yet. Next up, the hasty generalization. That's when we've generalized from too small of a sample, or we don't have all the information. Like the one that we looked at before about Bob being a student with 120 earned hours. He may not be able to graduate yet if he didn't take the classes in those 120 hours in the right order, with the right qualifications, in the right checklist. Next up, we've got the false cause or questionable cause fallacy. This is the idea that in an argument, someone might think that something caused a situation to happen, like a cause and effect situation, but they picked the wrong cause. Sometimes you'll see athletes thinking this way if they have like a lucky pair of socks that they wear when they're playing baseball. They might say that their team was caused to win because they wore their lucky socks, or the team didn't win because they forgot to wear the lucky socks that day. So the idea of cause and effect relationships potentially being the source of fallacies when people misunderstand what the right cause is, that can happen quite often in day-to-day life. Next up, we've got the fallacy of slippery slope. Slippery slope is when someone assumes that there's going to be a whole series of negative events that take place over time, and those a series of events gets worse and worse and worse, so then they don't want to do the first step in the slippery slope. The reason why it's a fallacy is because very often that causal chain of multiple events in the slippery slope, you could explain why it's not necessarily going to happen. It's not necessarily going to go bad. And that makes it a slippery slope fallacy because there's not enough evidence or proof that the causal chain of events will continue the way that they say it does. Next up, we've got the fallacy of weak analogy or faulty analogy. Analogy is when we compare two things. Imagine as a professor, we have two students in our class. One is named Elizabeth, one is named Jane. We know that they're both from California, and we know that they both like to wear flip-flops to class. And then we find out that Elizabeth is also a vegetarian. Would we then potentially assume, oh, Jane must be a vegetarian too because she is just like Elizabeth? That would be making a faulty analogy where the two things would not actually be comparable in that way. But then you could imagine that there will be analogy arguments that actually do have a certain amount of strength that do work that wouldn't be a fallacy. If someone is trying to say, well, there's two different noble gases that I've noticed. Neon behaves in this way when it's under an electrical current, and then xenon might behave a similar way when it's under an electrical current. That would be an analogy that would work pretty well because we're talking about two noble gases and they will behave similarly. That's how we would end up having neon signs that we can see around us. So when we think about this idea of an analogy, we just have to be able to ask, how alike are these two things that are being compared or being said to be analogous? Now, underneath acceptability, there's also a lot of those fallacies that deal with language and language being misused. One of the first fallacies is called begging the question. And if someone is begging the question, we sometimes say that in day-to-day life, but it's not really the logic way of saying it. If you beg the question, like an interviewer is interviewing someone on television, and then the person says something really interesting, and then the interview says, oh, well, then that begs the question. What that interviewer really means is that they just want to ask the next question. But in logic, if you have an argument that's begging the question, it means that you have a premise in the argument that is actually already saying what the conclusion says. It's almost like the argument is circular. The argument repeats itself. Rene Descartes, the philosopher, was famous for an example of this kind of begging the question argument. In his third Meditations, he actually has an argument for the existence of God, which is a very famous argument, and it comes out of a long-standing tradition of medieval philosophy where people had the cosmological argument for the existence of God, the teleological argument for the existence of God. But in Descartes, what he tries to say is that he makes his argument based on literally the size of the human mind compared to the size of the idea of God. So he basically says in his argument, I'm a human being and I have a finite mind. I have a mind with limitations. But I have this idea of an infinite being, the God. And then he says, well, if there is going to be this infinite idea in me, then there must be some greater being who has given me this idea. And then he says, therefore, God must exist. The last premise where he says there must be some greater being that gave me this idea, that's actually the conclusion. It's showing up earlier in the premises, and so it's a poorly done argument. Not that we're trying to say that his overall conclusion about whether God exists or not is right or wrong, just that that particular argument, the way that it was written, is an example of a circular argument, a fallacy. There's also the potential to have a false dichotomy or black and white fallacy. Some people call it the either or fallacy, when your argument has premises that assume that there are only two extreme possibilities and it discounts any other possibility within the middle. So, for example, at the university, if we are imagining that we have a problem with one of the residence halls, it's got something going on with the pipes or it's got some mold issues in the residence hall, we might end up having to say, okay, what are we going to do about this residence hall? And then maybe there's an administrator who makes this fallacy who says, either we're going to have to knock down this building completely or we're going to risk student safety. And he's portraying it as if those are the two options that we have, that there's nothing in the middle, like repairing the building or doing mold remediation or replacing the piping. So that idea that there's these two extreme choices in a false dichotomy fallacy and that that's all that we get to choose from, that's where that fallacy comes from. It's almost as if the person hasn't done enough of the sensory experience and empirical knowledge that Locke recommends to find out what the alternatives are going to be. Another example of a fallacy that's acceptability as a problem in the premises is equivocation. Equivocation refers to the idea that there's a word that shows up in the argument twice, but the meaning changes each time that the argument has been used. So when you think about the idea of an argument with the word appearing twice, but the meaning shifts, think about this example. If someone were to say, okay, the Chicago Bears are a professional football team, so they always behave professionally on the road. The word professional in that argument appears twice, but it means something different each time. If someone is a professional athlete, like the Chicago Bears are professional athletes, that means they're being paid to play their sport. But if we say, okay, their professional behavior on the road, professional behavior is a different kind of professional. It refers to the idea that they are doing the right thing, they are behaving well. It's not the same as being a professional athlete. So the meaning of the word each time it was used was different, and that creates a fallacy. Inconsistency is when you have an argument where there is an inconsistent set of claims being made. And sometimes people just do this because they're sort of speaking extemporaneously, they're speaking off the cuff, and they don't realize that they've made a mistake of being inconsistent. What if someone is talking about the issue of having to censor rock music that has bad images in it? They might say, well, I think that everyone has the right to express themselves and say whatever they want to, but when it comes to certain kinds of music, it just goes too far, so we have to stop them. That's an inconsistent argument. If you're saying at first that everyone should be able to express themselves in any way, then that's a problem. Then you're going to say, okay, we've got to punish certain people who do certain things that are not acceptable. All of a sudden, there's this whole other set of things that are not acceptable that we don't really know what they are yet. You have an inconsistency. Another example would be an improper appeal to tradition or past practice. Sometimes people will make arguments where they think that just because something has always been done a certain way, it's going to be able to continue that way. It's right for it to continue that way. Officially in logic, that's just not really a strong argument. It's got a bit of a mistake in it. We just got done with the Thanksgiving holiday here in the United States, and one might say, well, it's a tradition that on Thanksgiving we always eat turkey, so we must eat turkey this year. Not necessarily. There's not really a lot of separate evidence, empirical evidence for why we must eat turkey. It's a tradition, and that's really the only thing that we have to rely on is the idea that it's a tradition. And that makes a weak argument. It makes a fallacy. The example of a fallacy that I think is sort of the funniest is ambiguity. Ambiguity is sort of like puns, where someone is making statements in an argument that can be taken two different ways, and it's not really clear that the audience is going to understand which way to take it. There was an example some years ago here at VSU where students were able to get to a door in the top floor of our science building, and they would go out the door and hang out on the roof of the science building at night. They were not supposed to be doing this, and for a while the administration did not know that the door was up there unlocked and students could find their way out onto the roof. So the campus newspaper the next day had a headline saying, "Campus police kick students off the roof of the Bailey Science Building." Kick students off the roof is ambiguous. It can be taken in two different ways. It can be where the campus police went up there and said to the students, you need to get down off the roof, it's not safe for you up here. Or you could also imagine that it literally means that they were kicked off of the roof of the building and they landed on the ground. That's an example of an ambiguity. which is like a funny little pun, but at the same time, it sort of shows a lack of clarity in one's argument. Another example of ambiguity that might be fun for you to think about would be stories like, oh, there was an origami store in town that taught the ancient art of Japanese paper folding, but they closed, they folded. The store folding, the store closing, it's an ambiguity. It's a funny little phrase. It's a phrase that can be taken two different ways. There's also an example that I saw once that is kind of like a good joke for little kids. It was clear that the amazing magician who was in the jail, who has now been taken away and who was short, is a small, medium at large. Being small because he's short, being a medium because he's this amazing magician sorcerer guy, and then he's at large because he escaped from the jail. It's that kind of ambiguity that's sort of funny, that kind of makes nice examples to think about. Now let's go back to what Locke's theory is. Some of the examples of fallacies that we saw might have to do with different qualities in objects. Remember, his theory was based on the idea that empirical experience of objects gives us knowledge and lets us know that matter, the real physical stuff of the universe, is really real. When Locke gives us this theory, he also wants to say that when we do the simple and complex ideas, we have to be aware of where those actual qualities in those ideas live, where the qualities of the object reside. And he makes an interesting distinction about where the qualities of objects actually are. He says that qualities of objects can be either primary or secondary. A primary quality of an object is necessary for it to be what it is. So in the example of the table that we talked about before, the table has to be level on top for it to be defined as a table. So Locke would say that the primary quality of the flatness of the table lives in the table. But then there's other things that are secondary qualities that are more like the options that you would get on a car when you buy a new car. You could have a table that's not necessarily light brown. The table could be green. That's a secondary quality. It doesn't live in the object itself. It lives in us as a perceiver who is able to perceive things like color. You could also imagine that sometimes someone might put their hand on a table. For some of us, the table might feel cold. For some of us, the table might feel hot or warm. That is the perception of the individual person. So sometimes in day-to-day life, we have to imagine that we need to check our experience and make sure that we understand exactly what those primary and secondary qualities are and how they then create knowledge. Another example that might be kind of interesting for us to think about here is the idea of a snowball. If someone is in the snow, little kids are playing in the snow and they're able to make snowballs, we're then thinking, okay, what is it that makes this a snowball? It has to have the primary quality of being round for it to really be a snowball. But then when you make a snowball, if the snow is dirty, if there's been cars driving around and it's sort of got mud in it and dirt in it, it doesn't necessarily have to be white. You could still call a gray snowball a snowball. The most important thing for Locke is the underlying matter, the underlying substratum that makes up the snowball. And when you think about this idea of having, well, what is this substance there? There is a certain point where Locke's theory kind of falls apart and he doesn't know what to say about what the substance is made up of. If you imagine Locke's time, 1600s, they didn't yet have the understanding of things like molecules and atoms. They didn't have electron microscopes that would give us what the real matter was made up of. So it was the kind of thing where he had to say, it's got some kind of matter there. I'm not sure what it is. The philosopher who comes up after Locke, Bishop George Berkeley, really thinks that this distinction does not work. Basically, Berkeley wants to say that if everything that we see around us is going to be real, it's going to be empirical, then it's got to be perceived. And those perceptions have to be all secondary qualities. So you could think of it as George Berkeley is going to come along after John Locke and collapse all of the primary qualities into the group of secondary qualities. And then, if you're not there to perceive it, if there is no human being looking around, God is the ultimate perceiver, according to Berkeley. So when you think about that idea of having someone who needs to be there to perceive the things that we are talking about in the real world around us, it is interesting that there are people who find, as a matter of faith, God must be able to perceive everything. God must have this underlying story for how the world works. It's almost like having a choose your own adventure books. Maybe you've seen those books that little kids will read where it'll give you choices for what page to go to depending on your next decision. God is supposed to be the perceiver who's able to perceive the whole book all at once. God has the whole choose your own adventure book in his hand. But then you have the free will to be able to decide which pages you're going to turn to as you make your decisions in that particular book, in that particular story. Now, when we think about Locke, we also have to think about his theory of government. And it's really interesting that he finds that knowledge comes from experience and that we are a tabula rasa at birth. Because, in a weird way, his model for what we are as human beings and our human nature is kind of like that person who is pure of heart, who is not yet going to be in, some kind of judgment position over others. They're going to be having new experiences. I would say that, in the terms of like literature, John Locke's person in the state of nature is a noble savage kind of a person, almost like Tarzan, if you're familiar with the story of Tarzan. He was someone who was actually descended from British royalty, upper class people, and he ends up being raised in the jungle with animals in nature. And it's only when he goes back to civilized British society, when he finds out, oh, it's civil society that is corrupting these other people around me, they suddenly realize that they want to do things that are unethical because of their background and their experience, which I didn't have. So experience can end up affecting how we look at the world around us in a lot of ways. If you want to think about examples of American movies and movies that students might see that would have an example of someone who is pure of heart like this, there's a number of different Brendan Fraser movies that are comedies that do this kind of a noble savage thing. One of them was Encino Man. Encino Man is a very silly movie with Pauly Shore. And in that film, we end up seeing Brendan Fraser being a prehistoric man who was supposedly frozen in ice in a background in a backyard in Encino, California. And when Pauly Shore's family is trying to dig for a new pool, they find him there. Of course, we have to note that in this movie, the premise is very, very silly, and it's not the kind of film that, is based on empirical scientific evidence. You would never find a frozen caveman in Encino, California. The weather just wouldn't work for that. And then we can also think about movies like Blast from the Past. Brendan Fraser, the actor in this film, plays a man who was raised in a bomb shelter. Ever since World War II and the threat of nuclear war, his parents decide to live in a bomb shelter. And eventually, in the course of the film, he has to emerge from the bomb shelter and finds out what modern day Los Angeles is like. Of course, Brendan Fraser himself also played Tarzan in one of the versions of Tarzan in a film that you could think about. And then he also did a film called Airheads, where a group of musicians who are of good heart take over a radio station for a reason that they think is legitimate and ethical. That idea of somebody being pure of heart and having a kind moral character is also very influential in the history of the United States. If you think about the Declaration of Independence, this is written by Thomas Jefferson, but specific phrases within the Declaration are actually taken wholesale from John Locke's writings. For example, Locke has a phrase that he uses in which he says, everyone has the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. This idea of the pursuit of property, Thomas Jefferson had to change it. He had to get rid of it. He had to say, instead of life, liberty, and the pursuit of property, we can pursue happiness. And part of the reason for that is because, of course, this was written in a time in American history when there was still slavery, there was still inequality between the sexes, not everyone had the right to vote, not everyone had the right to buy property, but everyone had the right to try and be happy, according to Thomas Jefferson. Now, when it comes to this idea of Locke and the state of nature, it's really interesting to imagine whether you could have a state of nature that looks different from Locke. For Locke, he's trying to say that the state of nature is a good, positive place, but that we still benefit from having a contract with our government. The government contract will help keep the peace. There's going to be a court system with the government, and it lets us find out who is guilty and punish them. But then if you wanted to think about this idea of why we really need a government, if Locke's theory is right that human nature is inherently good, then it would end up being the case that you could say we really don't need a government. But it's not really going to go that way. He does actually want a government. It's just that he's going to say that you do have the right to decide to leave your government contract. You do have the right to decide to move to a different country. You do have the right to emigrate. The contract with your government is revocable in extreme situations in which you must acknowledge that your government has done something wrong or inappropriate. A different theory to this is Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes would say that you cannot ever revoke your contract with your government. That if you have been raised and lived in a particular location, you have to remain loyal to that leadership no matter what it does, no matter how corrupt it becomes. I think that's a very interesting theory. I mean, especially since Locke is an empiricist who believes that we gain knowledge over time in our life. It's like Locke is saying we hold open the possibility that we may need to learn more and that we may need to improve what our government's going to do. When it comes to the questions that we could ask about this, there's lots of thoughts that we might want to discuss. Are we really good or bad in our human nature? Can we say something about the way that human nature works and then how that relates to government? Is government really necessary, and what are the good reasons for government? What are the conditions where we could or should revoke the contract with our government? And then when you think about the idea of having a government that can punish, a government that has a court system that will punish guilty people, does that really guarantee the peace? It seems like we still have a lot of people who do wrong things, even if they have the possibility of being punished. It's almost as if they don't care or they're ignoring it. And then is being pure of heart just as important as using logic and reasoning, the way that Locke is recommending that we do it? Now, in case we want to think about how this relates to broader issues of social media, I can show you some examples of that as well. Social media sometimes can perpetuate bad reasoning and bad fallacies. If people are making fallacies on a regular basis, like with advertising, and people end up listening to those fallacies, they enjoy what it says, and they have that confirmation bias in which they like the ideas that agree with what they already assumed to be true, then we're going to have a problem with social media. How can we recognize and challenge bad reasoning online? And then what kinds of people could be using critical thinking properly online? How can we use critical thinking online to educate each other? Here's some examples of commercials that have the fallacies that I was talking about earlier. For example, the toothpaste. Over 1 million Australians are doing Oral-B toothpaste. This is a fallacy of popularity. And then imagine a sneaker company saying, just do it, everyone else does it. That's another fallacy of popularity bandwagon effect. We're looking at the idea here that the advertising relies on the idea that the popular thing is the right thing to do. Dos Equis ads, they very often rely on this image of the most interesting man in the world, and that's a fallacy of improper appeal to authority. This person is probably not somebody who we should really be listening to about what we should drink. And then we've got the example of the DirecTV commercials. DirecTV, for a long time in the 90s, had a series of commercials that involved the slippery slope fallacy. And one of them went like this: when the cable company keeps you on hold, you feel trapped. When you feel trapped, you need to feel free. When you need to feel free, you try hang gliding. When you try hang gliding, you crash into things. When you crash into things, the grid goes down. When the grid goes down, crime goes up. And when crime goes up, your dad gets punched over a can of soup. Don't have your dad get punched over a can of soup. Get rid of cable and upgrade to DirecTV. This is an advertisement that relies on the idea of the slippery slope. That if you don't have cable, then you're going to do all of these foolish things and it's going to get worse and worse. So you shouldn't ever have cable in the first place. You need to go to DirecTV. Those kinds of ads are entertaining and people find them very effective, even though they rely on bad reasoning. Here's an example of what happens with social media when people are doing good sharing of good critical thinking. There was a study that was done in 2021 in Cambridge, Massachusetts at MIT. And they decided to do a careful analysis of the cognitive style of people on social media. And then they found that people who engage in more analytical thinking are more discerning in their social media use. And they share news content from more reliable sources. And they make sure that they're only tweeting about substantial topics. This idea of critical thinkers being able to use social media more effectively is really an interesting question. It almost comes like a chicken and the egg problem, like which comes first. Will you end up needing to use critical thinking to be able to do well with social media, or can you be a critical thinker on social media who is making sure that you are sharing the right material that is vetted, that is carefully analyzed, that has an empirical basis, like Locke would say? There's another interesting piece of information from the American Psychological Association. They ended up wanting to do a important way of referring to literacy education with explicit attention to social media. And so they ended up, as a group of psychologists, wanting to make sure that they were part of the effort to build digital literacy skills, critical thinking skills for the internet world. And it's kind of nice what they decided to do. They acknowledged that 21 state legislatures have decided to reform their K through 12 media and information literacy. And they ended up having these efforts to try and help people use artificial intelligence more carefully. When it comes to this idea of how we can use social media and technology and artificial intelligence using critical thinking, it is really good that the United States is still trying to figure it out and trying to help with this effort. But at the same time, you may notice that there are other countries, like, for example, Australia. They've recently decided to ban all children under the age of 16 from social media. It remains to be seen how that will actually be enforced. There will probably still be lots of kids who want to be on social media and want to find out interesting stuff. But Australia has decided to take the more extreme point of view and sort of say, we really can't help these children on social media. But with critical thinking, maybe we could. Here's another example of journalists themselves and how they might deal with the social media problems that we've mentioned tonight. Journalists are increasingly experiencing the negative consequences of online news transformations like trolling and harassment. So, more and more journalists have started to turn to individual practices of disconnection, blocking, muting, and taking breaks from social media. I think that idea is probably important if we're going to have good critical thinking skills, and if we're going to use social media effectively without being tricked by fallacies. It may take a certain amount of disassociating and getting away from it. You don't want to end up being in that confirmation bias echo chamber where everything that you like to look at on social media is going to end up agreeing with what you already thought. Now, another example that I thought would be interesting to share with you, one of our colleagues here at VSU in political science, Dan Baraski, he recently published an article called Does Gen AI Have a Role in Public Affairs Education? Let's ask ChatGPT. You may be familiar with ChatGPT. It's a generative AI feature that sort of puts together information in new ways using algorithms. And in this article, he's trying to explain how there may end up being a way to use Gen AI in classroom learning and in public administration education. He's one of the professors in our Master's in Public Administration, Doctor of Public Administration graduate programs. So those are programs that cater to people who are already in some kind of a leadership position, but they want to be able to have a careful analysis and a careful ethical training in what public administration can be. So it's a very interesting possibility to try and think about how we could actually use some of these new technologies to actually educate people in terms of critical thinking and ethics. Here's my references, and I hope that you have found this talk interesting. I hope that it's given us some interesting things to talk about. If you'd like to ask any questions, I am very happy to have discussion now. Thank you.